at the Bulletin, the 4th floor of 54 Park Street, the great editorship of Trevor Kennedy. Many dreams floated in the stratosphere. It seemed that some writers of the Bulletin, the late Ron Saw and David Hazelhurst, had dedicated their lives to the dream of separating any link between notions of sobriety and sleep with longevity and good health. And Trevor, our editor, seemed to be motivated by a grander dream still, and that is to prove that human happiness can in fact be achieved by the storing up of enormous treasures upon the earth. Anyone who's seen Trevor in his later life empty a container of antiques purchased from the emporiums of London or Paris, and the gleam on his face knows that he fulfilled that dream to the letter. Great wealth, great happiness. And Trevor Sykes was determined to prove that some rationale, some link existed in the workings of the stock exchange. And that's the only dream that failed. My own dream was to win the glittering prize of pre-selection for a safe labour suit. A more exceptional dream still was that motivated Bob Darroch. And from time to time in those years still remembered for their Camelot quality in the history of Sydney journalism, that there was mention on the floor of the Bulletin of secret armies and D.H. Lawrence. I was distracted, but I'm now captured by Bob's dream, the whole notion clarified in the two lovely volumes I'm launching tonight. I remember Philip Burgoyne, one of the artists on the Bulletin, saying once of Sandra Darroch, he said, I still can't, he spoke with an English accent, he said, I still can't get over it. He said, you've got a continent of scholarship devoted to Bloomsbury. And he said, it's a tough little Australian girl who stomps up and throws down the biography of Lady Ottoline Murrell, an Australian girl who does it. And of course that's important because it was the hook that, and Robert tells the story in one of these two volumes, it was the hook that got him launched on the challenge of what Kangaroo was all about. And this link between D.H. Lawrence and secret armies in Australia, class warfare in Australia, incipient fascism in Australia. Lawrence was in Australia only between May 4 and August 11, 1922. 99 days in Australia. Kangaroo was the result, written in 6 weeks, 150,000 words sent off and published the next year. And Robert's thesis is that the novel records, as a diary does, what Lawrence and Frida got up to, the people they met. Somewhat novelised, but still it's an account that he started writing within days of his experience in Australia. In other words, he didn't know where this was taking him. And he didn't know, in his naivety, he didn't know the scale, the presumption of what he was recording. It's about secret armies. It's a novel about fascism, almost before fascism. And the Darroch thesis is that on the Austerlitz, D.H. Lawrence started talking to an Australian. He tracks him down, he tells the story of how he determined from the passenger list what Australian it must have been, Gerald Hum, who provided Lawrence with the letters of introduction to people in Sydney. And one of those people just happened to be a major from World War I who was up to his neck in a secret army, an army to save Australia from a socialist and Fenian takeover. So Lawrence turns up, as Robert says, a casual foreign tourist, and with a week of arriving, because of the letter of introduction, finds himself being told about plans to rescue Australia from socialism and Fenianism by the mobilisation of a painstakingly organised militia. a military force drawn from the ranks of those who served in World War I. He talks to Scott, who blabs. Jack Scott, disguised in the novel as Jack Calcott, who blabs about this and introduces him to the leader of the secret army, nicknamed, his cognomen being Kangaroo, based on Sir Charles Rosenthal, or at least that is the Darroch thesis, with elements of another character added by Lawrence. Why did Scott tell Lawrence that he was part of the secret army? And here Lawrence provides some insight into Australia's character. It's something Bob deals with because it demands an explanation. Why did this Australian, meeting an English writer, start telling him on their second or third visit about a secret military network, the revelation of which would have had him and his leader, the former General Rosenthal, conceivably charged with treason, a capital offence, and hanged? And in one of the fascinating parts of Robert's book, he deals with this. Why did Scott tell Lawrence, a complete stranger, about the ultra-confidential details of the secret army that lurked behind the King and Empire alliance? Scott himself has left nothing of his own to explain it. And in the end, after weighing the various arguments, certainly they wanted Lawrence to write for their newspaper, having lost the editor who'd gone off overseas. Lawrence would have been a great catch, a well-known writer editing their journal. But on the bottom line, Robert says, it was the essence of mateship, the Australian concept of mateship, that had Scott, former major, blab to Lawrence that yes, he thinks he can trust him, and he's going to tell him what's underway here. The formation of a secret militia that at the right time will move and prevent a Bolshevik assumption of power in Australia. Through all this, you're struck by the naivety of Lawrence, who's recording things he doesn't quite understand. There's no sign he understands the scale of what he's writing about. Nonetheless, he's recording and embellishing, reworking things he's hearing about the need for a mobilisation, a need to correct the excesses of democracy that have seen, even in New South Wales, just around the corner, the election of the most, Robert calls it, the most radical government that Australia had seen, the Story-Dooley government in New South Wales. A government created after the 1917 split, and the Labor Party had in fact veered well to the left. Robert devotes a bit of time to Lawrence's technique of using the world around him, diary-like, certainly in this literary enterprise, hearing things said and going back, and that day or the day after, recording them, but not as a diary, as a novel. He didn't know where it was leading him, but he was novelising what he saw in the Sydney winter of 1922. And he was recording, again without fully understanding the heavy implications, these former army officers talking about an attempt to overthrow democratic rule in Australia if it took a turn, as they saw it, for the worse. While biographers of Lawrence and editors of his works have seen this, they couldn't see it as anything other as a novel about fascism, about a secret army, they have almost ideologically, almost theologically, rejected the notion that Lawrence was writing from real life. And I don't think any scholar could devour these two volumes and hold to that view and dismiss the prospect of an alternative view and have that congeal as conventional wisdom. Dr. Steele, for example, used the expression, the Darroch thesis, quote, as now being shown to be without foundation, unquote. And without being irked by this, Robert just lays out what the evidence was that Steele was referring to, and calmly weighs it, leads us through, and leaves it for us to decide. I decided, reading this, that Steele and the other editors are quite wrong, that Lawrence was writing from life. He was meeting these people. They'd welcomed him into their secret world, and they were talking. A concept of mateship, embracing him as a mate, may have been part of it. Maybe there were other things. Maybe they felt safe talking about their deepest secrets with someone from the other side of the world. I don't think anyone reading this could doubt the Darroch thesis. In fact, it is impossible to believe that in a mere 99 days, Lawrence could have picked up enough material to produce this out of his imagination. And there wasn't material in the newspapers, not even in the bulletin, which he read regularly and enjoyed reading. The old bulletin with its pink covers that our friend Pat Rolfe had chronicled into the history of the bulletin. It is really impossible to imagine Lawrence in such a short time producing this material unless it had been served up to him in the way Robert posits. It's a novel, as Robert says, it's a novel about fascism. You get a glimpse of an Australian fascism here. It might have happened here, could have been a subtitle of Kangaroo, or indeed of Robert's study. These are king and empire loyalists. And don't forget, one theory of fascism produced by Isaiah Berlin is that fascism was a reaction to the forces unleashed by the French Revolution. And under Joseph de Maistre, one of the 18th century theorists, the original fascist, if you like, the alternative to the French Revolution of rule by the mob was to enhance the authority of the altar, of the throne, and the gallows. That was Joseph de Maistre in laying down an alternative to the forces unleashed by the French Revolution. Hitler said, and it's probably the one serious thing he said, "I am the revolution against the revolution." I embrace revolutionary means to destroy the forces unleashed by 1789 and 1917. And we here, Lawrence's characters, John Calcott, based on Major John Scott, Benjamin Cooley, or Kangaroo, based on Sir Charles Rosenthal, member of the New South Wales Parliament, a general, with elements of another character, stirred in, the other character being Australian conservative George Augustine Taylor. We hear the voice of authentic fascism. There's one discussion where Scott says to Lawrence, one thing we're toying with is letting the Reds win first, allowing the Job Garden and the Trades Hall and the newly established Australian Communist Party to take power, helped by the Catholics, another disloyal element. Let them take power and then we will move. It's a fascinating discussion and Lawrence records it. On page 95, for example, it's beautifully summarised in this quote. "Well now, my idea is this," says Scott, talking to the Lawrence character, Richard Lovett Summers. He said, "My idea is this. Couldn't we get Kangaroo to join the Reds, the IWWs and all? Couldn't we get him to use all his men to back Red Labour in this country and blow a cleavage through the old system? Because you know he's got his trump cards in his hands, these diggers clubs. We've got all the army men dying for another scrap. And then a sort of secret organisation has 10 times the holdover men than just a Labour Party or a trades union. He's damn clever. He's got a wonderful scheme already." And Lawrence is recording all this. This is the voice of homegrown Australian fascists. And of course the interesting thing is that it all quickly fades. The Labor government wasn't such a threat anyway. It did no memorable thing that challenged the power of capital, and it was defeated after one term, and the secret army, without that threat, faded away, and the common sense of Australians, the rejection by Australians in their bones, their rejection of dangerous ideologies came to the fore, and life went on, and in the pressures of the repression, a new guard emerged, a new guard being an echo of what had been at work here in 1922. There's, in Rob's research, there's a reminder of what a delight kangaroo is for people who know the Sydney region. And for those of my age, it's the Sydney region of their grandparents. That's referred to, that's invoked here. In one of the early chapters, and it's always stuck with me, Lawrence refers to, quote, this litter of bungalows, unquote. That's after a trip from Manly on the tram up through what we now call the northern beaches. And he talks about bungalows just being littered across the landscape. And those of us with childhood memories of an older Australia, an immediate post-war Australia, can still think of suburbs where, I think of La Perouse, which is, in my imagination, a litter of bungalows. What he's talking about is the first generation of houses on pre-1788 in Australia, the first structures on old Australia. And of course he talks about the harbour in one passage when Richard Summers, the Lawrence figure, and one of his acquaintances go and have sandwiches out at Mrs. Macquarie's chair. They look at he refers to the rusty fleet, the post-World War I fleet sitting there rusting away at Garden Island. And there's a beautiful description too of the south coast between the Royal National Park and Wollongong. It's a great description of Wollongong, sort of implicitly mocking Australia's dreams of an industrial future. The Lawrence character refers to our steelworks as the brickworks. Looks to him like a brickworks. So Australia's great 1917 integrated steel manufacturing is dismissed with that sentence. But he talks about the south coast at Thurrool and Stanley Park. He says there was this scalloped seashore for miles and a strip of flat coastland, sometimes a mile wide, sprinkled as far as the eye could reach with the pale grey zinc roofs of bungalows. Again, that notion of bungalows, the first generation of housing in Australia, permanent structures, yet scattered. And he says scattered, he says all scattered like crystals in the loose cells of the dark tree tissue of the shore. It was suggestive of Japanese landscape, dark scattered toy houses. Then the bays of the shore, the coal jetty, that's the one at Thurrool, far off rocks down the coast, and long white lines of breakers. And the sense of the old Australia is the way we go to this. I thought of the novel of Frank Dolby Davison, The White Thorn Tree, and a piece of work by Sumner Locke Elliott, a novel that starts with the opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge a decade after this kangaroo, of course. There's a description of a postman on a horse arriving at my work, blowing his policeman's whistle. And there are other hints, almost on every page, of that old Australia, of Lawrence going into Dimmick's bookshop in George Street. There's a library on the third floor and a second-hand bookshop. And we can assume, Robert suggests, that he's checking out whether his books are on sale. This part of the universe, there's very sweet material. One is struck by how lucky Robert's research was when he was at the house in Cremorne, out the backyard, trying to see evidence that there was a lookout that showed Middle Harbour, as described in the book, so he could pin that this was the location of Jack Scott's residence. There's no sign of that. It's not there anymore. But a housekeeper says, you might talk to the bloke over the back fence, and happily the bloke seems to be there. And he recalls in one flash that there used to be a lookout in the backyard, so the residents of the old apartment block would clamber up on this fern tower and get a glimpse of the harbour. But again and again, Rob has a stroke of luck. And as a result, this volume, The Search for Cooley, reads like a detective story. Lindsay Foyle told me that he's tramped around the lower North Shore with Robert. Little revelations in it, like going to the electoral roll to see if he could identify addresses and names, and being disappointed, but then realising that in 1922 there was a state as well as a Commonwealth electoral roll, and being able to find the name he was looking for, or looking at the passenger lists and then determining the person he might be identifying may not have been on the ship from Kandy to Fremantle, but might have been an Australian who chatted with Lawrence in the earlier stage of the journey in the Mediterranean. And thus is history rescued. Small things like this can disinter a story that would otherwise be covered by the sands of history. The great achievement, I think, in the book is on that all-important day, which is the climactic chapter in the novel. The novel where the Lawrence figure leaves the room. Why work? Yes, so happily protected by a far-sighted conservation order, and comes up to Sydney on the 6 a.m. train. And Robert manages, hour by hour, to track what Lawrence must have done on that day. What the evidence was for the fact that he only had buying a custard tart in Chinatown, looking at the newly opened Kuomintang building. Again, beautiful touches of Sydney history. And at 9 o'clock, he's got a meeting in the Trades Hall with the character Willie Struthers, who is based on Jock Garden, legendary foundation communist in Australia and Secretary of the Labor Council, and at a later date an associate of New South Wales Premier Jack Lang. And that's Lawrence encountering the face of socialism. But after filling in his time throughout the day, he has a dinner appointment with the Australian fascist, with Sir Charles Rosenthal, disguised, as I said in the novel, as Benjamin Cooley, with elements of the ideology of George Augustine Taylor thrown in. And that's one of those Dostoevskian climax scenes where people are shouting at one another, there's an explosion of emotion, and Lawrence comes down the steps of the Castlereagh Street apartment block shaking, and has to check into a hotel and collapse, and has a traumatic dream as a result. So it's a day where a lot of things happen. And there's a spectrum of politics encountered by our Laurentian observer. And I think it's a remarkable scholarly achievement to give an account hour by hour of what Lawrence did in that day, knowing as we know that every chapter is a novelised diary entry on his time in Sydney. Robert Darroch makes that case. And so it's an extraordinary work of scholarship. I think it's a tribute to the encounter with modernist literature that Rob and Sandra had, I guess, during their studies and their concentrated reading in later life. It's a great tribute. It's a great tribute to Lawrence as well, the force of Lawrence's imagination. I don't think anyone's going to read it without wanting to go back and read Kangaroo and the three great Lawrence works. But it's got, as I said, very sweet associations with people who are anchored in this part of the world, the Sydney region. But it's more than that. It's a tribute to the capacity of human beings dreaming in a journalist's office in Sydney, dreaming of things beyond the immediate work in front of them, to become captured become captured by ideas, and over the decades to pursue them and to nail them down, a desire to know the truth and to share it with others. And in that spirit, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to declare launched D.H. Lawrence's 99 Days in Australia by our friend Robert Darroch. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. That was a terrific and most sensitive and very intelligent look at the book and look at Lawrence himself. It's interesting that Lawrence really was a journalist to a great extent when he wrote that book. And we had a journalist, I still regard you as a journalist, Bob, as well as being everything else that you are, and a journalist wrote the book. So now we'd like to hear from